open up your Bibles to Matthew chapter 6. We're continuing in our series on the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus' famous sermon. We are calling it the greatest sermon, which can be confusing if this is your first week here and you look in the bulletin and you're like, that's a really high expectation of yourself there, Pastor Mark. You just think you're going to preach the greatest sermon. No, Jesus preached the greatest sermon. We're just talking about it. Well, it's actually a sermon about a sermon, so it's kind of meta, which I heard the kids are into. But in Matthew 16, verses 19 through 24, we're going to be looking at this really deep theological term. I went to years of seminary so that I could learn the meaning of this term. The term is stuff. Okay, so it's pretty. I don't know what the Greek term for stuff is. Actually, I think I do now. But we're talking about stuff and asking the question, is your stuff getting in the way? Is it getting in the way of following Jesus? So I did some looking on the internet because everyone wants to write some article on money and debt, especially about millennials. Apparently people are really concerned about my debt as a millennial, an elder millennial, but a millennial nonetheless. But average American currently is $38,000 in debt. 78% of Americans live paycheck to paycheck. 25% of Americans do not set aside any savings each month. When I was in my years of being a pastor, in the pastoral counseling I've done, usually one of two issues was why people came in, either unfaithfulness or money. Almost always one of those two things were the reasons that people came to talk to us. The average couple age 18 to 25 with kids spend 8% more than they make each year, which I'm not great at math, but I think the goal is to spend less than you make, or you're going to be in trouble. I mean, when you ask people these questions like, do you spend more than you make? Maybe someone comes in, they're having money problems. That'll be one of the first questions I ask, like, how much money do you make? How much money do you spend? And a lot of times they don't know if they spend more money than they make, which is a real problem. Sometimes they don't care that they spend more money than they make. There are many people who owe more on their car than it's worth. Some people think paying the minimum on their credit card is good financial planning. It's not. If you think it is, we need to talk later. And so we're talking about, I think money is the most practical thing that we have to think about, but we're talking about just all sorts of stuff, material possessions. In Scripture here, in this passage, it's kind of hard to nail down exactly. It's not like he's talking about just your bank account. Jesus is talking about all those worldly possessions that you accumulate, that you earn, that you work for. And so these, in the time that Jesus was preaching this would be property, this would be money, this would be some expensive items that you might have in your house. Maybe they're books, or maybe it's certain types of cloths, or anything like that. Anything that's physical and is valuable, this is what he's talking about. And unfortunately, when you think about all these stats in the world about debt and money and all that sort of stuff, the church in America, it often looks just like the world. We're pretty indistinguishable when it comes to statistical differences here. It's not like we have a better grasp on how to manage our stuff. We're chasing the same American dream. And so rather than looking like a countercultural inbreaking of the kingdom, we look just like the world. Spending every penny we make, accumulating more and more, and not giving it away. Chasing some future dream of thinking that we would be happy if we make more money and have more stuff. It's a famous American poem by Robert Frost called The Road Not Taken. If you didn't read it in high school English, then I'm sorry for your education. But it says, 2 roads diverged in a yellow wood, and sorry I could not travel both. And be one traveler, long I stood, and looked down one as far as I could to where it bent in the undergrowth. Then took the other as just as fair, and having perhaps the better claim, because it was grassy and wanted wear, though as for that the passing there had warned them really about the same. And both that morning equally lay in leaves, no step had trodden black. Oh, I kept the first for another day, yet knowing how way leads on to way, I doubted if I should ever come back. I shall be telling this with a sigh, somewhere ages and ages hence, 2 roads diverged in a wood, and I took the one less traveled by, and that has made all the difference. The picture here is that there's 2 paths, and he took one and not the other, and that made all the difference. You can't take both paths at the same time. You can't take both roads at the same time. You can't walk the path of the world and the path of Christ. You can't live for the treasures of this world and treasure Christ above all. You can't, as Jesus will tell us, serve 2 masters. You will always love one and hate the other. Your heart can't follow Jesus if your treasure is elsewhere. To put it more pointedly, your heart can't follow Jesus if your money is elsewhere. See, what if your heart is captivated on mission for Jesus, but let's just be real practical, but your money's elsewhere? Let's just say you feel called to international missions, but you have too much debt to go. What if you feel called to live a missional lifestyle, but because of having to pick up extra shifts or having to stay at the office too long, you can't do that? You want to give money to help the poor or support the church, but all of your resources are tied up paying your debts. See, a lot of us think we're spiritually devoted to God, but we're functionally slaves to our stuff. Here's the main point. You cannot serve God and your stuff at the same time. You can't wholeheartedly be a follower of Jesus Christ and be lost in your finances or a slave to your lifestyle or sacrificing discipleship for the accumulation of material possessions. You cannot serve God and your stuff. Here's what Jesus says in verse 19. Let's read out of Matthew 6:19 through 24. Do not lay up for yourselves treasures on earth where moth and rust destroy and where thieves break in and steal. But lay up for yourself treasures in heaven where neither moth nor rust destroy and where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. The eye is the lamp of the body, so if your eye is healthy, your whole body will be full of light. But if your eye is bad, your whole body will be full of darkness. If then the light in you is darkness, how great is the darkness? No one can serve 2 masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or he will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and money. So in this passage, I've broken it down into 4 simple dangers. Simple, not easy. Simple, not simplistic. Most of us will be able to understand this, but to actually apply it is very difficult. 4 dangers that our stuff poses in our lives as we pursue God. The first danger is this. Stuff does not last long. Look at verse 19 and 20. It says, don't lay up for yourselves treasures on earth where moth and rust destroy and where thieves break in and steal. But lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven where neither moth nor rust destroy and where thieves do not break in and steal. Before we jump too deeply into this, I think it's worth just acknowledging that at least I'm uncomfortable talking about money in church. Okay, like we've been, if you've been around church at all, as soon as the pastor starts talking about money, you're like, uh-oh, he's going to pass the offering plate. The last mission trip I went to West Africa, I thought they had it right. They did 4 offerings. I was like, that's amazing. Like, why don't we do that? One church I know of, they counted the money at the front, and there wasn't enough for the week, so they just passed it again. And I was like, hey, that's one way to do it. I like it. But most of us are nervous because when we hear a pastor talk about money, we feel like the obvious application is, well, then you need to tithe more. You need to give more money to basically me. I'm not interested in that. The reason we're talking about money and treasures is because Jesus talked about it. It's the very next passage in Matthew. I didn't set it up that way. Jesus thought that we needed to know this. In fact, Jesus talks more about earthly treasures, material possessions, and money than most of us are probably comfortable with, more than he talks about heaven. You know, I don't want your money. Jesus doesn't want your money. In fact, I can only find one place in the New Testament where Jesus asked for money, and it's a coin, so he can do an illustration and then he gives it back. Jesus didn't get rich off of people's money. I'm not interested in getting rich off your money. Jesus is not, he doesn't want to get your money. He wants to keep your money from getting you. So he says, there's two ways you can invest your life: in earthly treasures or in heavenly treasures. There's been lots of discussion in the Sermon on the Mount on the present versus the future, the earthly versus the heavenly, the temporal versus the eternal. And that we've had to come to grips with this idea that we ultimately live for an eternal reward, a heavenly promise. In fact, last week we were looking at the Lord's Prayer, the model prayer more accurately called. And Jesus taught us to pray, "Give us this day our daily bread." Which I said is very difficult for me because I want Jesus to give me my annual bread. Or maybe, I don't know how to say a decade like that, right? Like we want it for the future. We want the promise in perpetuity. We want Jesus to give us our pension, not our daily bread. We want to store up for ourselves riches. We want to store up for ourselves wealth. So we build up. But Jesus says, don't build up treasures for yourself on earth. See, in America, we're always looking for more. We have this view of infinite growth. You know, the stock market should never go the other way. A company should always grow and make more money next year than this year. Churches are that way too, unfortunately. We got to have more people next year than this year. We got to have more money next year than this year. We always have to outdo ourselves. And so individually what happens is if we make more money, we spend more money. And then we make more money and we spend more money. So it doesn't matter how much money we make, we're always out of money because we spend everything we make. Because we're always expecting to get more. And so when we pray something like, "Give us our daily bread," we're saying, I'm not worried about tomorrow. I'm not worried about 10 years from now. I'm not saying that this doesn't mean plan for your retirement. That's not what I'm saying here. What I'm saying is that when we pray this prayer, we can focus on God's provision today. We can be free of material anxiety. And so Jesus says, in the translation it says, "Do not lay up for yourselves." What he's really saying is this: stop it. It's my best psychologist impression, right? Like, stop it, right? Like, you're doing this, stop doing it, right? Don't lay up for yourself treasures on this earth. He's not saying like, well, if you think about laying up for yourself treasures on this earth, he's saying stop doing it because I know you're doing it right now. I see you living for the treasures of this earth. It reminds me of my kids when we go in the store. I don't know if you've ever seen this, but my kids, each one of them, have inside of them this monster called the want monster. And they get in a store and they want everything they see. They have toys they don't play with. They have toys they've lost, but they need it. They want it. I want. And it drives me crazy. And you want to know why it drives me crazy? Because that's exactly what I'm like. See, greediness and coveting, these are all in our hearts. Jesus' disciples aren't any better. When he tells them to go and minister, he actually explicitly charges them in chapter 15. Here, tells them in chapter 15, don't charge people for this. It's free. Because he knows that they're going to want to do that. And when Jesus tells the rich young ruler to sell all he has, the disciples are shocked. They're like, Jesus, that's crazy talk, right? Like, what do you mean? But Jesus knows that material possessions are temporary. They don't last. So he uses the illustration of moths, rust, and thieves. I mean, think about it. A moth is a pretty small and insignificant little bug. But it can eat valuable fabric, which would have been a commodity at the time. Or maybe some sort of books, that were, written on, paper. They could eat through it, or animal skins. It could eat that sort of stuff. A small, insignificant thing can destroy something very valuable. Or rust. Really, the word for rust here means literally to eat through. So this could be coins that rust, right? They oxidize and they rust. Or it could be a crop, right? Maybe you're a farmer and something, maybe an animal comes through and eats your crops, or they burn, or there's some sort of disease that destroys your crops. These things that you rely on can just be gone in a second, outside of your control. Or, of course, the most obvious thing, a thief could come and steal. But I think what Jesus is saying here is that these earthly treasures, because they can be gone in a second, if we're not careful, the pursuit of these earthly treasures, which don't last, will actually destroy us eternally. Meaning we will sacrifice our eternal destiny for temporary treasure. If we put it in kind of American modern terms, we can look at people who have been greedy because they want and they want and they want, and in the end they get destroyed. In 2008, the largest Ponzi scheme in American history finally fell apart when Bernie Madoff was captured. So I was looking at some of the stats. If y'all don't know the story, I'll try to kind of bring you up to date. So essentially, Bernie Madoff ran a fake investment firm, and he had over $17 billion of principal investments that he would get people to invest in his investment firm. And the pitch was this: you're guaranteed to get a crazy good return on your money, which is obviously a lie, right? You can't guarantee investments like that, especially at the rates that he was giving. What he would do is he would take people's money, he would use it to get rich, and then he would get other people to invest, and he would pay off the people that he borrowed from. And so it just grows and grows and grows. And the problem was in 2008 with the recession, he could no longer get new investors. And so he eventually was arrested. And it cost him his life, a 150-year sentence in prison. Even worse than that, one of his sons, just from the shame of this event, killed himself. But I was reading the story of one of the men who invested in Madoff's investment scheme. He put his $2 million retirement in here because he was told that he would get this crazy good return with no risk. And so he found out that he lost his nest egg. And so he had to stop eating out, and he stopped going to the movies. He refinanced his condo. But this statement that he said to the New York Times was, I think, a good illustration of what greed will do to us. He says this: my challenge was continuing on. My fear was getting old and decrepit. I don't have kids in my entire adult life. Part of my motive, listen to this, part of my motive for doing everything was a fear of being old and poor. Here's what motivated his entire life. He was afraid to be old and poor. When he boils his life down to his life choices, his fear was, I will be old and poor. Whereas the book of Proverbs tells us the exact opposite. It says, don't wear yourself out trying to get rich. I remember the first time I realized just how fleeting the joy of buying something can be was when I was in the 3rd grade. I saved up all my money for the whole year to buy a Game Boy. Still works, by the way. It might have been the best investment I've ever made. All year. And it was... I've been to Toys R Us, or now no more, RIP. But I went later when I had kids, and Toys R Us are not very nice, right? But when I was a kid, I thought they were amazing. Like, they had this glow about them, and they kept the Game Boys in the cage, so you had to go get the ticket, and it's like when you pay for it, and you go back there, and you just like, it's like there's an extra light above, and there's like a choir just playing like, oh, like right there. And so I got this Game Boy, and I went home, and I was supposed to go to bed, but I played underneath my covers all night long with a flashlight, because these are not backlit screens. There's 3 shades of green that are on a Game Boy screen. But then I remember the next day being like, okay, I guess that's what it was, right? Like, that's the end of it. And it's a thing called buyer's remorse. You buy a car, you're so amazed, you spend all this money, and the next day you're like, I guess I now have I just spent a lot of money on this, like what joy does this really bring me? See, no one at the end of their life wishes they had more money or more stuff. So Jesus says you should invest your life, your treasures in heaven, because heavenly treasures are incorruptible. Eternal life is incorruptible. Our eternal inheritance is incorruptible. When we get to heaven and receive the joy of our Master, that is something that can't be destroyed by earthly things. No recession can take away that joy. So what does it look like to store up eternal treasure? What do you invest in? What do you spend your time building? Are you using your worldly wealth for yourself or for the benefit of others? You know, when Jesus talks about accumulating heavenly rewards in the Sermon on the Mount, he says when you're persecuted for Jesus' sake, when you love your enemies, when you give generously to the poor, when you fast, these are ways that you're investing in eternity. See, there's a worldly economy and there's a kingdom economy. In 1 Peter 1, we're told that in Jesus we have an inheritance that is imperishable, undefiled, and unfading, kept in heaven for us. What does it look like to invest your life in eternity? When I think of an eternal investment, I particularly think of missionaries. And one of the most famous Baptist missionaries was a lady named Charlotte Moon. She went by the name Lottie Moon. Our Christmas offering is named after her. It's called the Lottie Moon Christmas Offering, and all of it goes to international missions. She was, during her life, she was courted by a number of men, but said, you know, I don't want to get married. I want to go be a missionary in China. She was actually famously almost engaged to one of the most significant seminary professors at the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary, but gave that up to continue her missionary work in China. During her 39 years on the mission field, she faced plagues, famine, revolutions, and war, all at the height of 4'3", which I always think is amazing. Like this tiny little woman who's had such a staggering impact on the kingdom. Hundreds came to faith because of her tireless efforts. And despite major budget problems in the mission board and a resulting poverty on the field, in fact, in 1911, there was a famine in China, and she gave all of her food and money to help those in need. And so by the time her bosses in the capital city found out that she'd been starving herself to feed the local population, she weighed only 50 pounds. It's the size of my 7-year-old, in case you're wondering. One of her young relatives asked her about being married or not getting married, and asked her this question. Said, "Aunt Lottie, have you ever been in love?" Her answer was this: "Yes, but God had first claim on my life, and since the two conflicted, there could be no question about the results." In 1887, she wrote, "I feel that I would gladly give my life to working among such a people and regard it as a joy and privilege. Yet to women who may think of coming, I would say, count well the cost. You must give up all that you hold dear and live a life that is, outside of your work, narrow and contracted to the last degree. If you really love the work, it will atone for all you give up, and when your work is ended and you go home, to see the Master smile and hear his voice of welcome will more than repay your toils among the lost." In the year of her death, 2,300 people were baptized in her little field of service, nearly doubling the entire Christian population in the area. And I mentioned that we have a missions offering named after her. Last year, $158 million was raised in her honor. She lived a life of eternal value rather than temporary comfort, because she understood that stuff doesn't last long. But we also see in verse 21 that stuff can captivate your heart. Jesus says, "For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also." See, what you treasure, both figuratively and literally, is a reflection of your heart. But it's not just a reflection, it's also a rudder for your heart that guides your affection. So when you invest in a stock, guess what? Now 3 little letters on a screen, captivate you. You pay attention. You love that company a little bit more because your treasure is there. The heart is the source of our thoughts and our desires and our decisions, our actions, and most importantly, our loves. But our hearts should belong to God, not to anything of this world. We're to love the Lord our God with all of our heart. So when you devote your life to accumulating earthly possessions, your heart truly belongs to those treasures rather than to God. But if we put our treasures in heaven, then our hearts are safe with him there. See, if your treasure is out of whack, your heart is mixed up in that. And where you send your treasure, your hearts follow. I remember when Whitney and I sold my first personal car. I had a 1992 Nissan Sentra. That's what I met Whitney in. You know, I had a car, she didn't, so that's all she cared about. Little 2-door car. We could fit quite a few college students in it. I think once it was a little 2-door. I think once we tapped out at 9 people in there, there was definitely one person in the trunk. So Oops. But it wasn't in the best of shape. And so I remember I think when we got back from our honeymoon, I just kept having issues with like the fuel pump, and I'd change it and nothing would happen. So we sold it for very, very little. And we bought our first new car. We bought a Toyota Corolla. Fancy, right? Brand new. And then a few months later, maybe a few weeks later, I remember I parked it somewhere, and I come out from the store, and someone has hit, just they're dinged your car, right? And all of a sudden, what are you? You're angry. I was angry, right? Because I spent money on this thing. And so now I care about this silly little car, right? Because my treasure went with it, my heart followed it. Stuff can captivate your heart, but stuff can also corrupt you. There's this puzzling illustration in verses 22 and 23 that talks about the eye, and in a healthy eye, and when an eye is bad. Here's what it says. The eye is the lamp of the body, so if your eye is healthy, your whole body will be full of light. But if your eye is bad, your whole body will be full of darkness. If then the light in you is darkness, how great is the darkness? So we've been talking about treasures and money, so it's kind of weird for us to see a metaphor about an eye. It doesn't really make a lot of sense to us. It doesn't seem to fit, but in the culture that Jesus was talking about during this time in Second Temple Judaism, this was a very common metaphor that related to money in a lot of ways. Regardless of exactly what it means for the eye to be the source of light, there's some question about whether it means light coming in or light going out. Regardless of that, here's the point, that what your eyes do affect the rest of your life. So if the eye is good, the rest of the body is good, and if the eye is bad, the rest of the body is bad. So let's look about that. Look at that metaphor about this bad eye. It says, "But if your eye is bad," verse 23. Literally, it says, "if your eye is evil." So it's like a little evil eye, which I received a few of those in school when the teacher was looking at me, but I don't think that's what it's talking about here. What does it mean for there to be an evil eye? The idiom here, the expression here, means to be jealous or stingy or greedy. Because think about that. Your eye is the first thing to see stuff. So when you want something, when you covet something, what's the first thing that notices? Your eye. You see it and you want it. That's what it's talking about here. It's talking about this draw toward greed. When we eat, we sometimes say your eyes are bigger than your stomach. Right? Your eyes see it and they want something. There's the famous discussion about how they would catch monkeys in the wild. They would take these little gourds and they would drill a hole in them and put some berries or nuts in them or whatever, and the monkey would stick his hand in there and grab it, but with a closed fist, the monkey couldn't get its hand out. The only way to get its hand out would be to let go. But they're too greedy to let go, and so they get caught. That's how they would capture them. And isn't that kind of what we do with our stuff too? We're too greedy to let go. We can't imagine not having this thing, and so it catches us. Our greed catches us. Greed is a trap that leads to so many other sins. Paul says in 1 Timothy 6:9, "But those who desire to be rich fall into temptation, into a snare, into many senseless and harmful desires that plunge people into ruin and destruction. For the love of money is a root of all kinds of evils. It's through this craving that some have wandered away from the faith and pierced themselves with many pangs." Embezzlement, stealing, wanting what you can't have, trying to keep up, all of this greed leads to our destruction. It corrupts us. And so if that's what the bad eye, the evil eye, the unhealthy eye is, then what is a healthy eye? The actual literal translation means single eye. Single eye. We translate it as healthy because we're kind of comparing it to the unhealthy. But single eye, what does that mean? It's a picture of single-mindedness, not distracted by materialism. In the same way that greed corrupts us, single-minded devotion purifies us. It cleanses us so that we can follow God. When we look around and we covet or have greedy motives, our affections and our actions become polluted and wicked. But when we focus on God, when we trust His provision, and we desire to live for Him, we can actually live generously. So a healthy body means that it's a generous one. one that's giving away, one that's serving rather than one that's taking. See, stuff doesn't last long, and it can captivate your heart, and it can corrupt you, and most dangerously, it can push you away from God. Look at verse 24. No one can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or he will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and money. See, we don't like ultimatums. I don't like ultimatums like this. I like a little Jesus sprinkled into my worldly desires. I want to, as the saying goes, have my cake and eat it too. But at the end of the day, you can only have one ruler of your life. You can be involved in a lot of things. You can have a lot of hobbies. You can only have one master. Only one thing can own your life. You can either serve the temporal, earthly treasures or the eternal. You can either serve the evil desires or the good. You can either serve your stuff, your treasures, your money, or you can serve God. You can't do both. Divided loyalties end up meaning you will love one and hate the other, because eventually they're going to get in the way of each other. So Jesus says you cannot serve both God and money. Now, if I was writing this, and I said, what is the opposite of God? I'd probably put in there like sin, Satan. You cannot serve God and Satan. You cannot serve God and sin, which is all true. You can't. But Jesus says you cannot serve God and money. Because probably for most of us, the number one competition for God in our lives is our stuff. It's not somebody. It's my money. It's my stuff. My time, my love, my attention's dominated by stuff. And so if we want to follow Jesus, we have to surrender everything, especially our stuff. If we talk about just personal finances, most of us would not say that we are a slave to our money. But when I'd be counseling people, I would tell them this. I would say personal finances are not a mystery. You know how much money you make, and you send it where it's going to go. So if you aren't in control, then guess what? It's in control of you. That if you don't control your money, then it's controlling you. That you're serving it. You're a slave to it. I think it's worth asking, do you own your stuff, or does your stuff own you? Because you're devoted to the master you serve. Our stuff is supposed to be our servant, not our master. Our lifestyle is supposed to determine our income, not the other way around. We shouldn't just make more money and spend more money. Because if that's the case, then our money is determining how we live. And there's multiple ways to be bad stewards of money. I talk about the one, like if you're in debt, then you're a slave to that debt. You owe someone money. They have control over part of your life. But you can be just as much a slave and addicted to the accumulation of wealth. You can be rich and be a slave to your money, and you can be poor and be a slave to your money. There's lots of ways to be a slave to stuff. There's been this phenomenon that's been happening through all of Christian history, but it's become kind of popular recently on social media, where we see that there are people leaving Christianity. Right, walking away from the faith. Sometimes very famous kind of Christians, which there really shouldn't be such a thing, but that's a whole nother conversation. But some of them will talk about it, and they'll say this, that they found that denying their desires for God's sake is just too difficult. But the Bible tells us that would be the case. I think I've done a terrible job communicating this. A lot of times I want to tell people how good it's going to be, how great it's going to be. But here's what I found being a Christian. Number one, the more I'm 1 foot in and 1 foot out, the less joy I have and the more discontented I am. And number two, the more all in I am, the harder my life is, but the more joy I have. I know it's hard to explain. But following Jesus is the hardest and most joyful thing you can do. And so when someone leaves the faith, I don't doubt that people who leave have found life to be a whole lot easier. and a whole lot more comfortable, but a whole lot less joyous. You cannot serve God and your stuff. You can't wholeheartedly be a follower of Jesus Christ and be lost in your finances, a slave to your lifestyle, or sacrificing discipleship for the accumulation of material possessions. So how do we practically apply this? Like how do you put this in your life? I wrote down 3 just kind of practical things that I think are helpful. And there's probably many, many more. I don't like to apply the Bible for you. I like the Spirit of God to work in your life and apply it. But let me just give you some practical things to think about. The first one is this: don't just surrender your stuff to Jesus when you're at financial rock bottom. You know, when you're like, I'm bankrupt and have nothing, Jesus, take it all. Like, what a sacrifice. You gave me your debt, I'll take that too. Like, a lot of times we wait till we have nothing left and we go to Jesus. And guess what? He's so gracious that he takes us even then. But you know what's even more beautiful? When you actually have something, you have potential, and you sacrifice it for him. You know, when you're offered that high-paying job and instead you take the one that fits the mission God has for you, that's a beautiful thing. Sacrifice should hurt. Number 2, just because you're unsuccessful at getting rich doesn't mean your heart isn't a slave to material possessions. Right? Just because you haven't been successful doesn't mean you're not envious of other people's stuff. You don't worry about it. You know, what do you daydream about? If you daydream about like winning the lottery and then all your life's problems will get better, guess what? You're a slave to stuff. If you think about if I just get that raise, then life will be better. You're a slave to stuff. If you're worried about your money all the time, you're a slave to stuff. And then number 3, consider the specific application in your life. Jesus was specific. What did he tell his disciples? He didn't say, leave it all. He said, leave your nets and follow me. That's their job. That's the tools of the trade. He said, leave your father and follow me. He told the rich young ruler, sell all you have and come after me. Jesus wasn't vaguely spiritual. He was painfully practical. And I imagine that some of us have something specific that we need to let go of to follow Jesus today. You know, for a lot of us who moved here to plant this church in Philly or moved to this area to do ministry, moving here is a sacrifice. It's probably a financial sacrifice. Don't begrudge your sacrifice. Be thankful that God allowed you to let go of stuff to live for him. We talked about at Easter the story of Judas and the woman who poured perfume on Jesus' feet before he was going to be crucified. And one of the points we made was that the woman saw Jesus as beautiful, so no amount of money was too much to give to him, to worship him. Whereas the disciples saw it as wasteful. Because for them, at the end of the day, in that moment, what captivated them was money, stuff. Why would this woman waste this? They didn't see what she saw in Jesus, and that was a beautiful Savior worth giving all to worship. There is no greater joy than knowing God, and I promise you, whatever you give, he will repay.